a loud noise. Okay, I'm gonna let everyone in.
Rachel, I have your book here because I was gonna hold it up.
You don't have to, please.
No, I'm going to.
Oh, we can see everyone. This isn't a webinar.
Yeah.
No, it's
Zoom
very
class.
intimate. So we've just got some more people in the waiting room.
Should I pin Rachel or should I? Is that?
Should we mutually pin?
Yeah, I don't know because I don't know how to like get the thing to stay on the screen.
Oh yeah, no, I think you guys are pinned, so you'll stay and I'll disappear after I introduce you.
Okay. Okay.
All right, well, we can get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight for a McNally Jackson virtual event. We are so thrilled to be able to do this and to be celebrating such a wonderful book. So I'm going to introduce these guys, even though I feel that they probably need no introduction. So Weike Wang is a graduate of Harvard University, where she earned her undergraduate degree in chemistry and her doctorate in public health. She received her MFA from Boston University. Her fiction has been published in literary magazines, including Alaska Quarterly Review, Glimmer Train, Plowshares, which also named chemistry the winner of its John C. Zacharias Award. A 5 under 35 honoree of the National Book Foundation, Weike currently lives in New York City. And she's in conversation tonight with Rachel Khong, who is a writer living in San Francisco. Her debut novel, Goodbye Vitamin, won the 2017 California Book Award for First Fiction and was a Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalist for First Fiction. From 2011 to 2016, she was the managing editor, then executive editor of Lucky Peach magazine. With Lucky Peach, she also edited a cookbook about eggs called All About Eggs. In 2018, she founded The Ruby, a work and event space for women and non-binary writers and artists in San Francisco's Mission District, and she is currently working on a novel. So I am going to let Rachel and Weike be in conversation for the next 30 minutes, and then we will have time for questions. You can submit those in the Zoom chat. And also, I'm going to drop a link to order Joan is Okay. You can order a personalized signed copy if you're at the event tonight, which is very exciting. So I will hand over to you guys.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you
Hi.
for doing this.
Of course. I mean, I'm so honored and really excited to be here. I love this book, as you know. It's just so beautiful and so moving. And I think just, you know, it really means so much, I think, right now, especially. How's it going? Like, how has the release been going?
How's it going? You mean like pandemic wave number 5 or whatever?
Yeah.
It's kind of going like wave 1 through, you know, where we were now. I think, and I mean, I think it's, you know, a lot of in-person things get canceled and now we're here and a lot of time at the computer. It's going okay. I'm glad that I have the ability to work from home, which is nice for most of the teaching and things that I do. But yeah, I mean, I'm kind of, I feel like I'm just stuck in Groundhog's Day all the time, which you probably do as well.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, we'll talk more about this, but just like as a writer also, like that feeling of like, wow, every day is exactly the same.
Has it helped your writing or has it helped or kind of like taken stuff away from it?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, right? Like, I think I've had more time to write, but I don't know if it's any good. What about you?
Same. I think I write high volumes and then you end up taking so much of it away and then you're just kind of sitting there stewing in sort of like current news. And I think you wonder why are you writing? Or, you know, why am I writing? What is happening here? So it is true. You have a lot of time, but I feel like I'm just like not going anywhere. So I'm sort of like running in place.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about just, I think to begin with, you know, this book shares a lot of like humor and sensibility with chemistry. But in that book, the narrator sort of, even though she's Chinese American, also sort of like kind of deadpan and funny, she goes unnamed. And in Joan is okay, obviously, like Joan is there in the title and she's Joan. Can you just talk about like how Joan came into focus for you as a character?
Sure. So, Rachel, you're actually a pretty funny writer too. So I think you have, and you're very good at also deadpan humor and deadpan narrators. So I think the voice has always been pretty straightforward to kind of hone in, but it just takes a lot of pages to sort of develop. After chemistry, I have an interest in writing female protagonists, Asian protagonists who are in STEM. I think just because I sort of know that field pretty well, and I'm fascinated kind of by the characters in it and sort of the work aspect and occupation. I just knew I wanted to write probably somebody in kind of healthcare, and the physician character was always sort of in the front of my mind. I have been writing, not very successfully, a story about like two friends, and one of the friends went through college and would be a doctor and whatever, and that character eventually just developed into Jonah. I was just more interested in her and her development, and I thought, well, why cover kind of the earlier years? Let's just cover kind of what this character is during the work sphere. And the more I wrote about work, the kind of more obsessed with work I got, because I'm sort of a workaholic. So writing about work made me indulge in my obsession with work. And so this character of Joan just kind of naturally came out of that. In some ways, I'm kind of making fun of myself, making fun of, people who understand like this sort of doing many things at once, or sort of coming from a kind of diversified background in terms of training and learning. So I think eventually it just kind of came together. And I don't know about you, but I try to outline and then I really fail at it. So I think I try to outline characters, try to outline a scene, and it just doesn't work. So when I first sat down to write the first page of this, it didn't really change. That scene started with kind of Joan thinking about her height, thinking about her size, thinking about a person's utility, and then ending with the idea of kind of like time, making sure that we're really making use of time and sticking your hand out and, not wanting your hand to be cut off or something like that. So that scene actually has stayed very intact. And the title actually came when I was writing that first scene, and I've never changed the title. I'm really bad at titles. I mean, I think you're actually really good at titles. Goodbye Vitamin is such a great title. But I just naturally not very good at it. And that the title came, and then eventually we just had this character come out, was fairly organic after that. So.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, Joan is always thinking about sort of her use and her utility. Yeah. And just as you were talking, and sort of earlier what we were saying about just being writers during the pandemic, it's funny, I think when you read the work of writers, often they like create these like artsy characters for maybe like a painter or a writer, or like something that sort of stands in for writing. Yeah. But I love that Joan is just something completely different. She's a doctor, and that actually like has a use. Doctors during this pandemic have been like incredibly crucial. And I guess I have a couple questions surrounding this. Just like one, what do you think being a doctor and being a writer have in common? And then also, I know you were pre-med in college. Why did you decide to become a writer instead of a doctor, which is, as you said, like way more useful?
These are very good questions, Rachel. I do think about this. I still think about it. I don't think I have very good answers. How are they similar? I actually think, well, it's problem solving. I do think there's a lot of problem solving involved in sort of figuring out, you're presented with, I don't know, a bunch of symptoms, a bunch of conditions, and you sort of have to culminate to a conclusion. So there's that aspect of kind of problem solving and working in the dark a little bit. And as a writer, I think we're perpetually in the dark. Like for years, we're just in the dark and we're not quite sure what's happening and things fail, right? In some ways, I find writing to be much closer to research than it is to sort of the everyday, like daily clinic, because there is sort of that beginning and end. And one sentence in the book, Joan thinks about death very differently at the hospital because it's so contained. Like she's able to think about, well, if someone dies, there's sort of this like post-mortem care that I have to go through. And then once that's taken care of, that's kind of taken care of. There's this really kind of discrete element to it. So in some ways that is sort of different, that once one problem is solved, you sort of just move on to the next one. With research, I find once you solve a problem, you have like 20,000 other problems, and then you have to go back and solve the first problem that you solved, and then you really just start all over. So with writing, I find it more closely related to when I was doing just my doctorate, of not really knowing where the end goal was, knowing where you started, but not knowing where you're going. And there's fewer unknowns like that, I think, in actual sort of doctoring every day at the hospital. At least it's not as permanent as I'm in a novel cloud for like 5 years where I'm thinking about this novel, right? And everyone's asking, how's the novel going? And some days it's going really well, some days it's going terrible, and then some days you have to kind of restart. So in that way, it is quite different. And so it's a joy actually to kind of write about her work because of how she thinks about it, right? She's able to put everything in their own little box and sort of proceed. In some ways, the reason Joan loves being at the hospital is because this is her home. This is like where she feels the most comfortable, where she feels the most useful. And when she leaves, because she's not able to interact with that work, I think she feels way less useful and a little bit less kind of vital, right? And because she's not thinking about it, she's not confronted with the problem. And in some ways, once you leave the hospital, the work is gone, right? You can't actually engage in that work. But with writing, at least for me, and you're just thinking about it all the time, right? Sometimes you wake up at night and you're thinking about it, and it's just like your mind is just full of this character all the time. You have no free space from it at all. So that I think is the disconnect. And so I try to do it with Joan, that because really she's not working until she's there, right? She always needs to be there. That location kind of becomes this home for her. To your question of why did I come out of it as a pre-med? Well, as you probably know, my college was a little intense. So I think going to that school, after a while, I was a little bit disillusioned about kind of, medicine and health, and sort of being an Asian woman in healthcare and kind of pursuing this, very, very stable, very, very straightforward goal of becoming a physician. I also shadowed and worked as a clinical researcher. And I think some of those experiences kind of continue to sort of wash away the gleam from that. There is so much benefit in that career, obviously. I'm not saying there isn't. But I think I got a little bit too, just a little bit disappointed in sort of like, what I would be like later on. And I've always had such a passion for writing. And I think in terms of luck, I ended up being able to, go to the BU MFA program and write and do that. And write my first book and then write my second book. So in some ways, I'm sort of just going along for the ride. And I don't actually miss it. I thought after I stopped researching, I would really miss it. Hasn't really happened. So I think, if I didn't write, I would really miss it. I think there's this compulsion that I have to write. I haven't written anything like a novel recently, if my editor's here listening. I don't have like an idea for like, novel 3, but sort of writing smaller things and like building up to that. And I find that if I don't write for a long time, I really, really need to put something down, even if I, never do anything with it. It's kind of like practicing and sort of like perfecting craft, art, and creating that. But if I think once I left Epi, if I never saw like table 1 again with confounders, I don't think I would be super, super sad about it. Yeah.
I would love to talk about, I guess, like stereotypes in
sure.
the book. And I feel like you do this really good thing of subverting them at the same time, or not actually like contradicting
Mhm.
some of them. Like, for example, Joan is very much in this like stereotypical good Asian person job,
Yeah,
and she's a
yeah,
really hard worker.
right.
And yet she kind of defies stereotypes by just being an interesting person.
Yeah.
Um, and she's like both in a model and not in that model at all. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that. And
Right. Well, obviously I want to give her sort of a rich interior life, and I think humor goes a long way with that, because if you kind of humor the reader, it really kind of creates that bond, and allows, Joan to open up. At the very start of the novel, I think, as a writer, with characters, we're very self-aware of what we're trying to do with them, like what kind of cliches or stereotypes these characters are pushing up against. But I think in creating Joan, I wanted to kind of make her a little bit oblivious of that, right? She states at one point to her director, well, I'm a model minority. How can you criticize a model minority? And it is a fair question. But it's sort of a very Joan question of her kind of literal sense of it, that she doesn't necessarily even mind the label, but she's very confused of how that could actually garner criticism. And that's just on my thing of sort of poking fun at some of these ideas, right? In some ways, stereotypes have come to being because of certain kinds of patterns and whatnot, right? And I'm very aware of that. But at the same time, in creating her, she does represent a lot of people in the healthcare or any workforce that are sort of invisible, right? But there's something about her that's obviously slightly different, just because everyone is different, right? So it's sort of this like cyclic problem. So I was pretty kind of clear that I knew what I was getting myself into with this character, and I thought, why not just sort of lean into that sense of everyone thinks that maybe she has these certain traits that are quote unquote weird or odd, or something like that. And I think if I had written the story in the third person or from another perspective, there would be a way to kind of give that, she would just come off as kind of a flat character, right? So the goal is sort of to start her as this kind of quote unquote flat character, and then as the reader is getting to know her, there's a sense of roundness in how she thinks and how she processes the world. And it's sort of just a joy to then be in her head. Even though if you were Reese or Madeline or her coworkers, you wouldn't get any opportunity to see that world. And I think I'm just interrogating the sense of, yes, this is a great worker. This is a great, she's very, very competent. But then, what is she thinking? What is kind of her mindset that maybe other people wouldn't necessarily have a chance to get to know? And I wanted to put her in the most human of all experiences, which is the loss of a parent. Everyone is going to lose their parents. That is universal. So I thought that was something that would bring, not just sympathy, but also the sense of, well, how is she going to handle this? That maybe she grieves. Of course she grieves, but she's doing it in her own terms. And I think everyone can kind of understand that with something as big as losing a father.
yeah, I think the way that, Joan is observing the world, she makes these like quote unquote normal seeming things seem very
Right.
strange, and like I feel like there's this way in which like America celebrates like uniqueness and individuality, and yet like Joan as an actually unique person is kind of looked upon as this like oddity among the people that just are surrounding her in her life.
Right.
And yeah, I was just curious about that question for you, like that spectrum of like normalcy and strangeness, and how you sort of like upend that basically.
Yeah, it is kind of putting her in. Well, I think in some ways it's kind of a challenge to me. Like, can I write this character in a way that I make her interesting? I don't necessarily, and I don't want a satire. I don't want to create a satire of her, and I don't necessarily want to make fun of the institution that created her. But I wanted to give her some sense of, distinctive traits that while are not necessarily wrong, can sort of make the reader chuckle and think about. But the end goal is, I actually wanted to just make her content with her position. I think sometimes even with these stereotypes, it's, oh, well, who wants to be robotic? Of course you're robotic. So you must be unhappy because everyone thinks that you're robotic. And Joan is almost like, well, I'm okay with it. Or I'm okay that you think this way. And I think other people, like her neighbor, it sort of bothers them that they're almost, their advice is almost gone unheeded because she doesn't really care about their advice in certain ways. And that kind of encourages more people to, advise her and tell her how she should sort of arrange her life. But I think, kind of to your question of upending things, and Rachel, you do this too in your writing, and also at New Prose at the sentence level. I think it's just surprising the reader, right? When I'm teaching, when I'm writing, and I'm telling my students here, I just want to be surprised on the page. I want to see something that I haven't seen before, even if it's just like a sentence that I haven't really seen been written in this way. And just finding some characteristics about her that are, that are surprising, right? I mean, she's, Joan doesn't have many friends in the book, but she really enjoys having her robot vacuum her house, right? So I thought, why not just lean into that and have her really kind of just talk to this robot and, we all talk to our things, or at least I do, have that quality about her that might make this strangeness seem a little bit more like an intimacy, that I'm letting the reader into a secret that Joan would never really want to share with anyone, but she's sharing it with the audience and the reader.
Right. Yeah. I think one engine that feels like it's pushing this story forward is just like the delight of Joan's voice, and like wanting to know what she's going to say next,
Right.
because it's so unexpected and surprising.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious about like your sort of craft of this. Like, are you just like eavesdropping on people all the time? Are you just constantly thinking delightful thoughts?
Delightful thoughts. Are you?
No.
No, I think, well, the eavesdropping thing, unfortunately, that does happen. That, if you're on a subway or if you're just there, you just listen. It helps with dialogue. It helps with things like that. I don't have a very good memory for a lot of things, but I have a very good memory for sort of speech and just things that I've heard people say and how it was said and when it was said and sort of the setting of that. So usually, if something comes up, I will use that there. But honestly, a lot of the scenes and the sentences just came from, me sitting down and saying, I need to get Joan from here to here. What's in her vicinity? How can I write to this point? What's extraneous? A lot of cutting and editing and taking things out to make it seem streamlined, rearranging stuff. I think, in terms of rearranging everything and just making sure it's fluid. And after a while, once you write enough of these quote unquote delightful thoughts, some of them are not as delightful after a few months, so then you cut them and then something fresh comes in. I'm sure if, I were back at editing this, which you could edit a book forever, right? Like we could just keep going. There would be slight tweaks that I would make, things that I would change. But at that moment, this is kind of a culmination of really like 5 years of thinking about something and thinking about a character, and thinking about how she would approach the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like, it's just like really well done. And just, I think it's so hard to do, obviously, like this lightness that's balanced with, this like heaviness that's also in the book, which is like all the sort of things surrounding her family, also just like the tragedy of like the pandemic itself. And I was thinking of this like Paul Valery quote while I was reading the book: one should be light like a bird and not like a feather. And just how, like, I think it's this really deceptive lightness that's in the book that I think like is obvious that, you spent a lot of time on and was really sort of hard won. And so I'm just kind of wondering, how do you, this might be a hard question, but like, how do you go about creating the lightness and balancing it with these really heavy topics? and also just what like draws you to like a sparser sentence, like a lighter
Right.
sentence.
Right. That is Rachel, I could ask you all of these questions about your book. I'm going to record all of this, and then when I do your, I'm going to ask you all these same questions, because your sentences are also very lean and very beautiful and clean, and sharp. Well, with with kind of balancing that lightness and heaviness, I do have to really credit some of my really early teachers. As Amy Hempel did a great deal for me in terms of kind of helping me understand creative writing. I think before she came into my life in college, I didn't really understand the concept of writing. I thought, to write something, it had to have this like gravitas, right? This kind of, idea, and it sort of had to be heavy in terms of how you're writing about it and serious. If it wasn't serious, then what are you doing, right? And she really gave me a sense of what else you can do in prose and writing. And so from her, I started reading a lot more. And in my MFA, Sigrid Nunez, right, was my MFA advisor. And she was also just very instrumental in teaching me how to write, not necessarily in workshop. I mean, she's very funny in workshop, but I read a lot of her writing. And I started to realize that she had such a deft hand at being able to balance two things, and to create something that was funny, emotional, had sentiment, and sort of was not lacking in quote unquote big ideas, right? So that balance, I do have to credit a lot of my early teachers. In terms of why I like sort of simpler sentences and cutting, I really think it comes down to having to write a lot of scientific abstracts. Like if anyone here has ever written a scientific abstract, you have this like word limit, like you can't exceed 350 words or 350 characters or something. So I spent a lot of time trying to cut sentences down, but also get the idea across in as few words as possible without losing the meaning. And I'm also, I don't really like doing housework, but I do like cleaning obsessively. So I sort of think
You have a robot vacuum?
I do have a robot vacuum. I also have a Dyson, Rachel. So I am kind of very skilled at the vacuuming. So, I'm so used to kind of cleaning things and taking them apart. And so with sentences, that sort of was just delightful in being able to do that. Yeah, so I think it kind of played to some of the strengths that I have and just like what I was, trained to do. And trust me, writing a book and like editing those sentences, as painful as it is a lot more fun than trying to get like an abstract down to 350 words.
Yeah.
You have to find synonyms and things like that. So
Yeah.
so I think I had that kind of like penchant to do it. And also being able to, say a lot without wasting a reader's time. I think I'm very cognizant of, I'm a little worried that if I lose the reader, they're just not going to go on, right? And the reader can put down their sentence at any time. I mean, I tell my students this, but I have to read their work, right? I have to read their work sometimes I think. But a reader out there who's buying your book and they want to read your story, they can get bored very easily. So I think the goal is not giving them an excuse to be bored, to keep their attention, to sort of surprise them without losing any kind of sense of teaching them something, or at least showing them something that maybe they wouldn't get otherwise from other mediums.
Yeah, you have this thing in your book. A couple characters are described as room people.
Yeah.
And they like just can't imagine wasting another person's time. And I just thought of that as you're talking about the way that you write. Do you think that has something to do with that, liking the shorter sentences, just being like, I'm not that person who just is like, everything I say is great.
Well, when I had Hajin as a teacher, one of his advice to me was, Weike, you need to be more long-winded if you're going to write novels. And that kind of terrified me after a while. I mean, he's very kind. He's like a very paternal figure. But I thought, I don't know how to do that. Like, how am I going to do this? So I don't think you actually have to be that long-winded, but there is a sense of sort of stretching an idea. And sometimes from the short story to the novel, what I've learned is that there are ways to kind of expand an idea without necessarily losing the reader or overcomplicating the prose, but clarity comes first, right? The reader has to know what you want to say and sort of moving that along. So instead of being long-winded, I think sometimes it's like unpacking an idea to sort of like, you know, proofs, like you're just expanding it and not sort of giving the person the final conclusion. To your point about room people, that's in reference to her neighbor who, you know, means well and wants her to succeed and wants her to be kind of the successful neighbor that he thinks she is capable of.
Have some furniture.
Yeah, and have some furniture and have TV and not live in what he thinks is sort of this void. So all of that comes from, I do think, a good place. I wouldn't have written him about, you know, I wasn't trying to say that, you know, he was malicious in any way. And I think at the beginning, Joan is actually okay with this because she has this perception that if this other person is talking, then I don't need to talk and I can just sit there and kind of just relax. And at the beginning, that works out well between her and her neighbor because her neighbor likes to talk and kind of chat with her, and she can just stand there and like sort of doze off in her mind. And she's always so tired. But I think later on, she realizes how potentially that was maybe not the best relationship for them. It wasn't reciprocated. He very rarely asked questions about her. He really rarely wanted to get to know her in a way that, you know, wasn't through his lens, right? So I thought that why not kind of have that sentence of people who kind of take up a room and they're the life of the party. They're, you know, fun to be around when they're there and when you're spending time with them, but maybe sometimes on a day-to-day it's not as enjoyable as Joan initially thought it was going to be.
Yeah, and her life is completely fine without all his furniture and his pies and stuff.
Right. And you know, it's like sort of this idea of being helpful but not being helpful, right? Some people really want to help you, and I get it. Everyone wants to help and kind of extend, you know, generosity, right? It's not, I'm not saying Mark isn't generous. It's just almost like the not even asking for permission and believing that you would be, of course, love to receive my generosity.
I just want to remind people to type questions into the chat box. I do have a lot more questions, so you can also not type any questions, but it would be nice if you did. So please just type them into the chat and then I can ask them of Weike. But I want to.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes. But I have so many more questions for you. So I feel like I should ask you questions because it's
Oh, well, you know, the reason I invited Rachel because I've been a huge admirer of her work. I have a book here. I just want to show it. Can I show it? It's called Goodbye Vitamin. It's a beautiful book. I love the cover. And I think one of the hardest things for me is actually control of time, right? Like this idea of creating time gaps. And with Joan, that was one of the biggest challenges, was figuring out how to do the timing thing. And I would actually say that, you know, because your book is so structured with time, I sort of borrowed this idea when I was kind of putting in the headlines from the pandemic. I was like, I think I need timestamps. I need to figure out how to do that. And my question to you, is that something that, you know, the structure of timing, is that ever difficult for you when you're writing, or does that come naturally?
Yeah, I think it's so difficult, obviously. Like sometimes I'm like, why are we, like, it's so hard to write. Obviously being a doctor is very, very hard. And like, I couldn't do that at all. And that's infinitely more useful. But I think that, like, I think you said before, just like writing is so inefficient. It doesn't make any sense. You're always like writing the thing and then erasing it and like reading it, rereading it. And it still doesn't make any sense.
And it frustrates you because you're like, this is like the language that I'm fluent in.
And you're the same. I mean, in theory, you're the same person coming to the same text over and over again. Why does it change so much from day to day? And yet it totally does. And so actually, like, that was something that I wanted to ask you too, was just the timeline of your book. Like, when did you start working on it? And then, like, when did you start working in COVID? Because that's so, like, it's both so recent and also a while ago now, but like, COVID is a presence in the book. So is like anti-Asian violence. How did, where did the book end when COVID wasn't part of it?
Well, so I do remember finishing a draft of this at some point in like the early 2020s, right? Before really like the March craziness hit. And at that point, there was no COVID in the book. There was no pandemic. I think maybe I referenced it a little bit, but very, 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 very little, because I thought this was, after 3 weeks or whatever, this wouldn't
Yeah.
happen. I had no idea that this would come out in like this Omicron wave, right? Who would have predicted this? And so there was really no sense of that pandemic kind of thing before that. And then, me and my editor sat down and we sort of had a very good conversation about should we incorporate the pandemic or not, right? She's an Asian ICU doctor. I picked that occupation even before the pandemic. So it seemed like the reality of her life was that she would be dealing with something like this. And I had no intention of setting it in, before like 10 years ago or 5 years ago or whatnot. I knew I wanted to write a contemporary novel. So it did make sense to fold it in. And I told myself I wouldn't have folded it in if I couldn't do it in a plot oriented way. I mean, I didn't want Joan to just sit and fret about, the pandemic like I do. That would just be too real in terms of what, how I think about the pandemic. But given that she's useful in this hospital setting, given that her mother has come to visit her and now can't get back, those are all experiences that I find very real during that time. Like, it was a crazy 8 months. Trying to get my grandmother back to China, like every, flight was just canceled after like every flight. No one knew, what was happening. And it's still very difficult to travel internationally. So I knew something of that. And I knew that if I was going to incorporate the pandemic, it couldn't be just like it's happening, on TV. It had to really integrate into her story of expulsion, coming back, her mother's storyline. I think in terms of the anti-Asian, racism and hate crimes, that was something that I knew I wanted to touch on, just the history of Chinese immigration in this book, sort of like the Exclusion Acts, and how that's really not talked about or ever. I mean, it's talked about, but it's never really taught in a full capacity. And I think people are always surprised that, I don't know, Chinese people were banned for like 60 years other than having to work in the restaurant industry. So I knew I wanted to put that in, since that's so much of kind of like the ambition behind someone like Fang, right, her brother, wanting to sort of prove a point. And naturally that led to the contemporary problems and discrimination. I do remember when COVID did start coming out of Wuhan, and I just thought, I worried that I wondered if it would happen, right? Like this Chinese virus, a lot of things that seem to be infectious come from Asia, and sort of the, this sense of like invasive species, like an Asian something, whatever. The lingo around that has always somewhat been there. And I was just like, I hope this doesn't happen. And then it did, right? The news reports and things like that. Not necessarily so surprising, just for the first time foregrounded, where I don't necessarily think Asian discrimination is foregrounded at all, because she's a physician, and maybe her coworkers wonder if she even experiences discrimination because she's a doctor, right? And this idea of being standardized in a system that is so prestigious and respectable and useful, how can she experience discrimination? And that's I personally experienced the sense of, do you even face discrimination if you're Asian? Asked by someone who's not Asian. And I think it's actually an honest question that they have, right? Because not much of it is actually written about or kind of spoken about. So once those events started happening, I just knew that I wanted to incorporate it to an extent that made sense for the character, of her not necessarily questioning her commitment to the occupation, but other people questioning her commitment to the occupation. Like, do you even want to help if this is maybe the danger that you're walking into now?
Yeah, and she's, it is almost like, I mean, it's a terrible thing, but it's like sort of perfect for the ending of the book. Like throughout the book, she's been experiencing all these, microaggressions, I guess you'd call them, just these ways in which she's reminded of how she's.
And you say this, I really enjoyed writing Reese as her coworker.
Yeah,
for some reason. And he does, I don't know, you know,
Yeah.
he wants to help her, quote unquote, as a coworker, but he doesn't really understand at all. But I really did enjoy writing that character with the microaggressions and things that, you know, to the reader would be so obvious that this is somewhat of a microaggression, and Joan is just a little bit confused, actually.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So we do have a couple questions. I wonder if, I mean, it'd be fun since this isn't a webinar and people can, in theory, like on video, like, you know, show themselves on video. Winshin, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. Hi.
Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Sorry, I'm still
Yeah.
at work. But thank you, first of all, for the event and your time. And I love both your books. I was curious about this idea that writers tend to fall into either a generator, like I just love getting new ideas and getting things onto the page, and then more of an editor where you're like, oh my God, generating sucks. I just want to be handed a page to just, you know, revise and work with something. Do you feel like you fall into one camp or the other? And if so, how do you get yourself to do the other one? Like if
Yeah.
you hate editing, how do you bring yourself to do it? Is there like anything that you'd recommend, you know, or not even recommend, but just what do you do to get through both?
Well, I do think you have to be a generator at the very beginning, because, you know, if you don't have kind of the idea, there's really nothing to edit. I sort of know I don't have a very good idea when I'm just editing articles, like, you know, I'm just like moving sentences around and nothing really quite makes sense. But I do think at the beginning, you have to generate the idea. It doesn't have to be the complete idea. It sort of either could be character driven or maybe even plot driven, but there has to be the sense of, you know, something that you want to write about, some material that you want to tackle. With Joan, once I started writing about her and how she was speaking, that material just came to me pretty easily. And I used to be afraid that when I first started writing, I used to be afraid that I'd run out of material. I don't think that's going to happen now. I think I'm actually kind of comfortable with being able to generate ideas at a more regular pace. But it does take a lot of thinking and sort of like filling up this well and then taking buckets out of the well and putting it together. Sometimes you're writing about the same material, the same idea over and over again, but you're kind of trying to do it in different ways. Like in chemistry, it's a completely different narrator, but they're still dealing with very, I would say, similar issues in terms of, you know, sensing their place in the world, path, identity. But I'm just telling it kind of slightly changed. And then being an editor of your own work, I think that just comes at a little bit of a later stage in terms of like cleaning it up and polishing it and making sure the idea is not over labored or overwritten. But I actually think at the beginning it's probably better to overwrite, because then you have more to cut. If it's underwritten, then it's just really hard to fill in the meat of the story. What about you, Rachel?
Oh, I think I probably work very similarly to you. Like just, yeah, like in the beginning, I think you need to have something, or at least for me, it feels like I feel panic if there's nothing. And just having something to then sort of like move the words around in, like just having the single sentence on the page is so, I think like that's the part that feels like fun to me, right? Is just like figuring out exactly where the words go.
Once you have that idea and you know that narrative is sort of set. Yeah, that is the fun part.
Corinne, thank you so much for that question, by the way. That's really
Thank you.
Good. Yeah. Does Corinne want to ask their question?
Sure.
Hi, Corinne.
All right. Hey. So I was wondering if there were any specific books or authors that you read during, like, when you were starting to get into creative writing that really interested you, or like influenced the way that you wanted to write and craft stories, especially since you said you had more of a medical background than creative writing or literature. So was there anything like specifically that once you read it, you were like, this is the thing, or like, this is how I want to write?
Right. So earlier I had mentioned that when I was, in college, sort of taking my first workshop, not knowing what workshop was, I had no idea everyone read your stuff and commented on it, and you were in this like cone of silence. So at that time, I was mostly just reading what my teacher was giving me. And then I ended up reading a lot of Hempel's stuff, which was very, very helpful in terms of creating voice. I think I'm really glad I honestly had her as a teacher. I don't think I would have been as voice conscious if I didn't have someone who was voice driven at the very beginning. And Rachel, you're also very voice driven. So I think it's the sense of like finding a first person, especially like a first person narrative voice that, you can jive with and you can get on the page and sort of have fun with. So I had read Tumble Home, which is Amy Hempel's novella, and I teach it now just because I teach this novella class, and the structure of that, as a letter, right, and sort of being able to kind of create that letter format while telling a story was very inventive to me. So from that, I sort of thought out more kind of voice-driven narratives. Before I'd written down or even came up with this idea, I had read this really, really fun novel, The Convenience Store Woman, right? And it was just a delight, right? I think I had, a week where I was like, I want to read something fun, and that was just a bright cover, and it's about this woman who works at a convenience store and is just so in love with it. And I thought, wow, I wish I could move a story like that, just like page by page, the plot kind of escalates, and it's so tight in terms of character development, not that many characters, every character is used really well. And so those things sort of ended up culminating in trying to create something that was character driven, voice driven, but not necessarily lacking in plot. My first book does have plot, but it is much more of an internal novel of her going through kind of a crisis of, belief, or crisis in her belief in science. And with this book, I wanted to kind of flip it a little bit and have more external factors move her along into the story. So yeah, those were the things I was reading during that time.
Thanks for answering.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Corinne.
We have a few questions from How You. I don't know if How You would want to share them.
Oh, hi.
Sure, hi. Since I have a few, I'll just ask one so that other people get to ask questions first. So in both of the novels, the main protagonist enjoyed scientific humor, which I also immensely enjoy while reading it. So what made you decide to give them this trait?
What do you mean by scientific humor? That's kind of fascinating, right? Like humor about science, or just how to think about science?
Yeah, exactly. So I remember reading chemistry and thinking all of these metaphors are weaved into the story so
Yeah.
perfectly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and reading Joan, there were lots of, I guess, strange thoughts that came into her mind that's very medically related. I guess that makes sense since it's her profession and it's what she
Yeah.
knows. But these things come up and they're very funny. Both are very touching and funny books. So I was wondering what made you decide to.
That's a great question. Well, I think with chemistry, that I wrote at a time where I was still in the doctorate. So I think that book was in some ways my discovering what I really loved about science. And I still love science, and I still love kind of learning things. But research is slightly a different area. And so weaving those things together, I'm always fascinated by sort of the combination of like science and art, and sort of finding a detail and kind of crystallizing it, making really a pearl out of a piece of knowledge that I have, and just making it more relatable, but also more art driven. And with Joan, if you've read enough textbooks, science can be really boring. So I think when I'm thinking about making something a little bit more palatable to kind of an everyday reader, I wanted to get out the medical, you can't use medical lingo in a book like this. So thinking about how Joan would maybe have to explain this to someone else, right, who doesn't know anything about this. And as I was interviewing my friends about kind of like, what would an ICU attending do? This machine ECMO kept coming up over and over again, and I thought, well, why not why not have ECMO be her friend too, right? And kind of think about ECMO as this sort of inanimate friend who she's able to, picture as kind of life-saving, but also this just like bot. So a lot of it is maybe taking a very serious thing. These are machines, they're engineered to do very amazing things. Science is engineered to do very amazing things. And just to kind of come in at a tangent with them. Yeah. Did you have another question? How you had, I think, a few.
Yeah, I had a few. If nobody else had questions, I'll just ask them.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So my second question was, you've talked a lot about not naming your characters. Well, in chemistry, I remember there was only Eric and the other characters were not named. Is there a particular reason for your naming almost all the characters in Joan?
Yeah. Well, every book is sort of a cure from the previous book, so I didn't think I could pull that again with not naming my characters. Although Joan, the name just came to me pretty easily. It was monosyllabic name. For some reason, I really like monosyllabic names. Strong, it's straightforward. I could find like a simple Chinese translation for it, so that was easy to incorporate. With chemistry, I didn't name a lot of the characters because, and I say this to some of my students, with names comes sort of this sense of assigned identity, and then identity, thinking about identity questions. And if I wasn't going to tackle them in the book, I felt that if I just threw the name there, it would kind of be sort of a thread. So with Joan, if I was going to name her, I knew that if I named everyone, there had to be kind of a reasoning for that. Kind of like what her name represents, what her brother's name represents in some ways, right? Kind of the choice to Americanize, to not Americanize, that sort of plays a role in the story. And I just thought, why not kind of take on that sort of challenge of creating the characters. And I'm glad I named the characters. It does make talking about characters much easier when they are named.
Do you want to ask your final question? We have another question, but I think it's totally fine for you to ask it. And I'm also I want to say props for reading the book so quickly. It just came out and
yeah, I devoured it last night.
Oh,
I really enjoy your writing. Yeah.
Thank you. I wish it was that easy to write it. Don't finish that, Rachel, like in a night. Yeah. Book's done.
You just have to read it again for 5 more years.
Yeah. Every day.
Yes. I'll just quickly ask my last question then. So in chemistry, it was the main character was obviously a chemistry PhD student, and in Joan, it was a doctor who lived in New York. And this is a giant assumption, and I apologize for this, but I feel like those characters are very related to your experience, and I was wondering if you would write about things that are very different from what you know or what you, I guess, are experiencing. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, I would 100%, if that came to me in terms of, I mean, I really want to write a ghost story, like a horror story. I would love to write a children's book, or, something that's kind of, I would have to really kind of veer off in a certain way. So these are all dreams that I have, but we'll see. Sometimes if I'm kind of just taken with an idea, I will go with it. And I do think so. I think, when you first start out with writing and then your first couple books, there is a sense that I had a buildup of material that I wanted to move through and wanted to make sense of. And I'm sure that my experience and sort of that material will crop up in other places. But, it's one of these things that once Joan is done, I don't feel like I'm ever going to write like, a doctor character as a protagonist again. I feel like that I kind of did my service for that character. So it sort of gives me permission to explore other things. But this was something that I just thought was important to write about this character, and kind of there's a responsibility that I felt like I had, and also a responsibility of representation that I felt like I had for this book, that maybe I won't necessarily have later on, as I'm developing and growing as a writer. But great question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rose, do you want to ask your question?
Hi. So nice to see you both. Thank you so much for the talk so far.
Of course.
And I just wanted to ask what advice you have for women in STEM who dream about publishing novels, but may not know how or be brave enough to take the next step. Asking for a friend.
Sure. Well, to your friend, it's a very good question. I would say taking some classes. I don't think I would be the writer I am today without really kind of working through, great instructors, generous instructors, and instructors that sort of gave me their time, and also working with incredible editors, and being open-minded, right, about edits, and learning how they edit and learning how to become a better writer from that. I think every editor I've worked with has sort of improved me in a different way of thinking about kind of a story, and thinking about shaping it. And that's something that I've taken later on. So I would say at the beginning, kind of getting your education, right? Like no person would one day say, oh, I'm going to be a doctor, and then just show up at the hospital with like a stethoscope and then try it out, right? Writing, as with any art, requires practice, but also like STEM also requires practice and getting good. I really underestimated how much reading I had to do to become a better writer. I mean, Rachel reads way more than me. What am I talking about? Rachel, you read so much. Your Instagram is just full of things that you read. But how much reading I have to go into to kind of become a better writer. And I was recently reading the, Don Lee's story collection, Yellow. I don't know it. I don't know how I've ever missed that collection, but it is actually a great story collection with divergent experiences. And I was reading his interviews, and he was saying he did so much research into each story to get something that he hasn't experienced, so he could kind of create a full story. And so that was very helpful to kind of learn the process. So I would say not rushing it. My editor, who always advises me that you can only do a book once, and that's 100% true, right? So it's going to be out there forever. And it's good that you like it as a writer, and that you're happy with it. And it doesn't necessarily cause you anxiety that it's out there. So yeah.
I think the bravery question it's such a good one. I mean, it's in STEM, it feels like there's more of there's uncertainty in every field,
Right.
but I think writing is like sort of uniquely scary and art can be uniquely scary because there's just a very small chance of success, unfortunately.
Right.
How would you speak to that? Like just that fear of like.
Yeah, no, it is prevalent. Well, I mean, I think with that, I was lucky enough that when I was writing, especially at the beginning, I had other kind of like part-time jobs and things like that I was trying to do at the same time. And I always sort of told myself, well, if writing doesn't work out, I'm gonna, I don't know, do something else, or I'm gonna kind of like actually, use my Harvard degree or something. And there's sort of that safety net. And obviously I'm not doing anything with those degrees, but that was something I just kept telling myself. Bravery is really important. I think I don't actually think about that when I'm writing. When I'm writing, I'm not thinking, oh, I need to be brave about something. I just need to get something out. I need to get something out on the page, and I need to make sure it's good. Recently, I wrote this essay that's getting fact checked like crazy. And now that I think about it, me writing this essay at the time, I wasn't like nervous about anything, but now I'm terrified of it because, it's nonfiction. But at the time, I didn't think about, oh, should I write this? Should I not write this? Right. Publishing is kind of a completely separate thing from writing. So writing that first thing is really important. And, not being scared about what Rachel was saying was complete inefficiency, right? By the hour, you are spending a lot of time writing, and it might not be very good. But over time, we do get better, and it starts to be better, and it's kind of training that intuition. But you really have to love it, I think, right? Like with the arts, you really have to love it. And you know, you can't imagine yourself doing anything else. And you can't imagine not seeing your words on the page or, you know, existing outside of that. Right. It's one of those things that if I didn't write, I would completely miss it. I think I would, you know, if I had to give everything up, and I don't think I could give up writing. I could give up a lot of other things, but I don't think if, you know, you said you're never going to write again, that would be very devastating for me. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Well, we're at 5 o'clock. I don't know if does McNally Jackson have any final words?
I'm muted. That was, I think, a wonderful note to end on. That was a great event. I loved that. Thank you so much, guys.
Course, yeah.
Thank you, Weike and Rachel. Congratulations on the book. Thank you to everyone for your questions and for coming out.
Thank you.
Order the book. I'm going to drop the link again in the Zoom chat, but it's also online. You can order your signed and personalized copies tonight. So I definitely suggest doing that. And these always end very abruptly. So I'm sorry, I'm going to do that now. But thank you everyone for coming. That was
Thank you so much. Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah.
Bye.